Anaya, mom, boob nerd, board-certified lactation consultant, and lover of lipstick and curse words. I'm that weird Indian girl you knew in high school, all grown up.
And I'm Alexis, mom, birth nerd, and therapist plus doula, encouraging parents to hold joy plus what the fuck is this mess simultaneously. Some people think I'm too much, but those aren't my people.
And we are the Top Knot Squad.
TKS is a tiny little podcast about motherhood in real life, the good, the bad, the ugly AF.
Hosted by two women that are passionate about our beliefs and unafraid to speak our minds.
Friends that wanted to create space for all that ish we are too scared to talk about.
Are you ready to laugh, be vulnerable, and keep it real with us?
Top knots are not required.
If the Top Knot Squad content makes you laugh, nod in agreement, or makes you feel less alone, we'd love your support in the cost of producing this podcast. Visit patreon.com/TopKnotSquad to learn more about our budget-friendly sponsorship tiers and how you can help ensure that TKS has a future. Every little bit helps. Content warning. On this episode of TKS, we will be discussing a very heavy topic, birth trauma. This topic can be triggering for some, so please take the space you may need. We recently shared an episode on this topic, and when we spoke with Ann Tropea to discuss creating safe birthing spaces and hear what informed birth means for her, but we felt like this topic is so big and complex that we wanted to allow more space to unpack a bit more and also to offer some of our own personal and professional experience around this important conversation. Plus, we have a ton of questions from the squad that we didn't get to answer last time. So let's go ahead and dive in.
Yay!
Yay. So for everybody listening, we're recording this in person. This is the first time since March 2020, I think.
No, I think
February.
we virtual recorded in March too, because I was really pregnant and didn't want to drive.
Yeah, since February 2020.
Yeah.
So like a year and a half almost.
Crazy.
Now you have a new human.
Yeah, and he's over a year old and dangerous. And
our podcast studio moved, so they have a very cool new facility that we're in right now, which is awesome.
Very fancy. Yeah, love it.
Well, let's dive in. I'm going to let you take the lead on this one because this is your field of expertise. I definitely have stuff to add in there, but I'm gonna defer to you to talk about big T and little t because you describe it so much better than I would. That's really what it is.
Yeah, I guess I just thought it could be helpful for us to just kind of give a broad definition of what birth trauma can include, which I think we talked about a little bit in the last episode, but just if we could dive a little deeper. In a general sense, I think we hear the word trauma, and that means something life-threatening, or someone died, or my life was at risk. It's like a very big, scary natural disaster, rape, war. Like we think of these really big things, which of course are all extremely traumatic. But that definition or our mind kind of going to those big T events doesn't really take into account all these other experiences that, whether real or perceived, still create a trauma response for that person in their brain and their body. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, there's some examples like listed here of big T, thinking about, especially with birth, it's a whole body experience. So you may have previous trauma that's not related to the birth. So whether you're a survivor of sexual assault or domestic violence, or you had a previous birth that was traumatic, or a previous loss that was really traumatic. Thinking about all those past experiences that we may bring into this new experience, because a lot of times that gets reawakened just from the natural birthing process that's happening in your body and your brain. And then also just thinking about, like in the birth space, there can be trauma that happens. So pain that is ignored, forced vaginal exams, episiotomies, or essentially any intervention that does not have consent. So there can be really physical experiences in that birth space that are painful or traumatic. Perinatal loss, a stillbirth, a NICU. And then also just, again, so more of a general sense of like loss of control. So it may not be like the physical process of something that's happening, but just a general, I'm not feeling seen, I'm not feeling heard. I don't have choices. I'm not being given options. And that power differential that can happen, and how that can create fear and feelings of not being safe.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that all of this birth trauma can be felt in a variety of settings. It's not always I think maybe being in the space that Alexis and I are in, when we hear birth trauma and we automatically go to births that happened in a hospital with an obstetrician that wasn't listening, or a nurse that was just really persistent about whatever, that was not what the birthing person wanted. But these can happen anywhere. They can happen at home. They can happen at birthing centers, all of the places. And so I think, it's important to remember, in our last episode, we definitely touched on obstetrical trauma a lot, but it's important to remember that it doesn't just happen with OBs. It can happen with any care provider.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even too, like, just from my own personal experience, I 2 of my births were transfers. So even just that, the process of transfer felt very traumatic to me. So my second birth was a birth center to the hospital, and then the third time we were at home and then to the hospital. And so even just thinking about, each of the, like, this is not short for, well, actually, we'll probably talk about your experience.
Yes.
But generally speaking, there's different phases to the birth process, right? And so different things can happen in each of those phases that could be traumatic too.
And again, just wanted to interject one other thing. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder. That's a quote that basically maybe not a quote, but a concept that I kept coming up on when I was reading information to prep for today's episode. It's on paper, or to other people who are also observing the birth, it may not seem traumatic to them. But if the birthing person finds it to be traumatic for whatever reason, then it's traumatic. And I think that that's really important to note, just because I know oftentimes birthing people are told, oh, well, baby is fine. You're okay. Everything is fine. But it's not fine. Maybe that's the end result, but everything could have gone off the rails in order to get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like feeling there's a lot, I mean, in a general sense, for survivors of any type of trauma, there's a lot of dismissiveness of that experience. A lot of blame is placed on them versus the system or the perpetrators that caused harm.
Right.
And how we can shift our language can really impact how that person is seen and how they're able to heal. So I would add that too. So those are the big T's.
Sorry, we got off track there.
Yeah, it's fine. But the little T's are not, little does not mean that they're less adverse or any less difficult. Again, all of these experiences, if it's being perceived as traumatic by the birthing person and by their body, because the body keeps the score a lot of times, what you're experiencing is not cognitive. It's actually in the body. It's real. And valid, and the same process is happening. The same stress response is happening no matter what the actual event was. And so some of those little T that aren't often talked about as much could include any chronic stress experiences such as poverty, racism, gender bias, etc., microaggressions, cruel language, lack of communication, that feeling of loss of control that we talked about. So, and honestly, I think these little T's I'm using, you can never see in what we're doing when we're talking, but I'm using quotes. These little T's to me are oftentimes in the work that I do, the bigger work. Like when people are coming to see me and they've experienced trauma, like they are telling me about how they weren't seen, heard, validated, understood, and how they were dismissed and how they were ignored. And that's what's most painful and what's most likely keeping them stuck.
Right.
And so I think we need to figure out a way to make this conversation be more inclusive of all these different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I had put on here is, Alexis touched on it, my birth with my second is what we would call a precipitous birth, meaning that it happened really, really fast. And so everyone's like, oh, you had such a fast labor. That's amazing. Sure, it is now. But when I was in it, everything was moving so quickly. And again, going back to that loss of control, everything was happening much faster than what I could wrap my mind around. So yeah, I had him out really quickly. I labored for a very short time. I only pushed for, a couple pushes and he was here. That's fantastic. But I was it was so hard for me to vocalize or to articulate what was going on with my body because it was all happening so fast. And so, just because we think of difficult births, we hear about the long births that may end in an emergency cesarean or just really long births. Yes, those are absolutely traumatic, but the really, really fast ones can be traumatic too. We had a whole NICU team that kind of came in at the end there just because everything was happening so quickly. And we had a NICU team there present for my oldest as well because he was preterm. So, even just having more people in that birthing space became a factor for me. And it kind of I started going in my head about like, oh my gosh, the NICU team's here. What if he has to be taken away? What if baby is not okay? All of those things come out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's scary.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think too in like the most simple terms, when there's trauma, there's a lack of safety and a lack of connection.
Yeah.
Like that's usually what's happening and why there's a body response.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, there's two really great resources that talk a lot more about what we're describing. So one is the birth trauma tree, which is, what is that? Unfold Your Wings. We'll include them in the show notes.
Yeah.
But Unfold Your Wings created it's a literal tree.
Okay.
And so it's a literal tree, and they have, coming out of the leaves at the top of the tree are kind of all of the symptoms and what you might experience after a traumatic event. So anxiety, bonding issues, insomnia, nightmares, panic attacks, depression, shame, avoidance, flashbacks, physical pain, intrusive thoughts, irritability, relationship difficulties, fear, grief, etc. And then the roots of the tree are all the different experiences that can cause those symptoms. And so the roots, the reason I like this tree is because it includes everything we just talked about. So It's not just those big T traumas, but it also includes a lot of those little T events, from poor care to cruel language, loss of a wanted birth experience, lack of communication, lack of information. So it's a good visual of what we just described that can be helpful for some folks to look at. Then the other good visual is from Birth Monopoly, and she has this triangle to represent obstetric violence culture. That's what she calls it. And basically, at the very bottom of the triangle, like she has at the very bottom, all that matters is a healthy baby. Mm-hmm. So thinking about how our culture like normalizes these experiences and again, like dismisses and minimizes what's traumatic or not, that's at the bottom of the triangle. All this normalization and this culture of, well, you have a healthy baby. That's all that matters.
That matters.
Above that, there's some others. So like jokes about pain, loss of dignity in birth. I just posted that today. There was a viral TikTok going around.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
Do you want to describe it?
It was two, I'm guessing they were obstetricians, but they were in scrubs. And the caption or the little text at the bottom said, when she's been pushing for 3 hours. And the two of them, the two people in the video are kind of like dancing and almost like jovially walking into an OR for probably a stat C-section. Mm-hmm. And so there's obviously there's a lot of backlash from people in the birth world about how wrong it is, about, again, it's not just a healthy baby that matters. We want to make sure that the experience is as positive as possible for everybody. And also there was a tinge of them making that decision for her rather than, again, informed consent, letting her weigh out her options, all of those things.
Mm-hmm, totally. And just the like centering them versus centering of the birthing person, like where we don't know anything about this person's story. And it was just like very like making fun of.
Yeah, it was dismissive. I felt like it was dismissive, and I felt like, honestly, it was crass and it was just in poor taste.
Yes, totally. So that's at the bottom of the triangle are kind of these experiences that we're describing where it's really normalizing violence and harm.
Yeah.
And then as you go further up, at the very tip of the triangle is like actual assault, like physical harm. So forced procedures, use of physical force, legal coercion, bans on vaginal birth, procedures without asking, without consent. And then in the middle part of the triangle is degradation, so bullying, intimidation, threats about baby's safety, mocking pain or suffering, disregarding a birth plan. So it just really kind of shows how there's like a spectrum.
Right.
And how ultimately, honestly, those little T events that we described are kind of all fall on the bottom here. And it's like, I think that's why they're not talked about as much because they're so normalized.
Right.
So, yeah, we'll include that link too. Birth Monopoly in general is a wonderful resource.
It really is.
In regards to birth trauma and just knowing your rights and, helping you connect with the right resources. Yeah.
Yeah, both before and after birth. So we have on our list as well to talk about oxytocin versus cortisol and the impact of chronic stress. Do you want to speak a little bit to this?
Yeah, I just think that this is what I mean when I talk about birth being a whole body experience and how it can feel, for some folks, it can feel really unexpected how much shit like lights up or resurfaces from our past and not just birth, like pregnancy, birth, postpartum. So much of that experience is within our body, like things are happening to our body.
Right.
And so much of it is hormonal as well. And then trauma is hormonal. Like trauma is eliciting the stress response for you to create safety. And that's a hormonal process as well. And how those those butt heads.
Yeah.
And so it can, we need oxytocin, the love hormone. We need that to have contractions. We need that to bond with our baby. We need that to breastfeed if we want.
Yeah.
It's involved in so many different parts of the process. We need it to make the baby.
Right.
Right. It's like it's there throughout that whole process. And then, like I said, the stress hormone is cortisol. And so if we are stuck in a trauma response and we have this experience that hasn't been fully processed, our body remembers. And whether, something is a real or perceived threat, like our body is going to automatically go into that response of fight, flight, freeze. And we don't really have control of that. Like our body is built to do that for us and protect us in that way. But it can interfere with all of those other things I described. And so that's why for trauma survivors, like sex can be really hard. It's why pregnancy can feel really hard. It's
lactation can be really difficult.
Can feel really hard. Yeah. So just thinking about how those hormones interact and how they aren't really the best of friends.
Yeah.
And if you have chronic stress and you have experiences in your lifetime that haven't been fully processed or acknowledged or resolved, your body is going to be more prone to release that cortisol and respond in that way so that you can feel safe.
Yeah. Cortisol is actually a suppressor of oxytocin. So we always, in the lactation world, if a parent is trying to pump or if a parent is trying to relax enough to have a letdown for that milk ejection reflex to occur, you need oxytocin. But if they're sitting there staring at the bottles the whole time, thinking, oh my gosh, why is my milk not coming? Why am I not letting down? Why is nothing happening? Then that cortisol, that stress that they start to feel suppresses the oxytocin, which delays the letdown, which causes more cortisol. So it's really all part of a vicious cycle. And this is, tip of the iceberg, very basic explanation I'm giving right now. Obviously, it plays a larger role in labor and contractions coming together and dilation happening and effacement happening. So if a birthing person is in a stressful environment or they're made to feel stress while they're birthing, of course their body's going to stop doing what it needs to do. It goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode to try and protect them. So yeah, I just wanted to make a mention of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch a little bit also on birth trauma and lactation, just because this is something that I see oftentimes. For those who are listening for the first time or haven't tuned in very often, I'm a board certified lactation consultant and I work in outpatient exclusively. So that means I work with families after they've been discharged from the hospital, from the birthing center, or, if they need support at any point during their lactation journey. Sometimes I'm the first provider that a family is speaking to after baby's been born. Speaking to at length. Our appointments are anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, and that's a lot of time to cover lactation and lots of other stuff. So oftentimes, I will ask the question, what was the birth like? And sometimes I get a long pause and I'm like, okay, well, we don't have to talk about that. And other times they tell me, oh, it was fine or it was great. But oftentimes, the stress from the birthing process can delay the transition of milk from colostrum to mature milk by even several days. Occasionally, those families will have to supplement baby with formula or donor breast milk or whatever to get through that time. And it's not a sign of failure. It's not a sign of anything. Your baby has to eat. For some reason, too, if breastfeeding doesn't work out for that birthing person, they also perceive it as a huge loss. And so in addition to having a very traumatic birth where they didn't feel seen or heard or that loss of control, again, they're losing control and feeling a significant loss when it comes to lactation as well. Sometimes, too, if a person has had a birth where they felt disempowered, they felt degraded, or just completely out of control and unable to ask questions, they may not feel very confident in asking for support or for advice when it comes to lactation. They may be feeling shocked. Oftentimes, I've heard clients that come in, well into lactation, and it's one of those things where if they had come in sooner, some of these problems may have been avoided. But oftentimes they feel very overwhelmed. They don't feel confident in the support that they'll get because, again, they're going back to what happened to them during birth. Sometimes I've even heard people say that they felt like their voice was taken from them during birth, which is hard. You're welcoming a new human, whether it's your first baby or your fourth, it doesn't matter. It's still incredibly difficult.
Can I add a piece? Just what you're talking about as far as like it's another loss if, breastfeeding or chest feeding doesn't work out. And this is from my personal experience, but I, of course, also, this comes up in a lot of the work I do. But I did EMDR therapy to help with my birth trauma. That's what was most helpful for me. And part of the EMDR process is like identifying what the negative belief is that you've established about yourself. And so for me, it was my body's broken or I'm broken. And so I felt that in the birth process. And then when feeding happened and any challenges came up, it felt the same too. Like, why isn't this working?
Right.
Or even, for some folks that can feel true with like bonding, like, why do I not feel immediately connected to my baby? And like, I'm doing something wrong. I'm broken. Like, this is my fault. Like, those are a lot of the scripts that exist for survivors of trauma. And so that for anyone that is working with them and supporting them, like that's kind of the space that they're coming to you in, like that of like, I can't do that. Like they already come in defeated. Like I can't do this. It's not going to go right. And so anytime that you can meet that with that safety and connection and reminding, which I know you do and you're already describing of like, no, we can make a plan. We can do this. We're going to help you meet your goals. Like just being really mindful of like the language that we use.
Absolutely.
Can be helpful too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, there's definitely terms, and I think we've mentioned this on some past podcasts, but there's definitely terms specifically in women's health that are just awful, just terrible terms for medical conditions. And men don't have that,
Well, yeah, actually, now that you mention that was a lot of my work because I was termed failure to progress.
Okay.
Which, my script is I'm broken.
Right.
And I've been diagnosed with failure to progress.
Right.
Like makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and to me, I view failure to progress is actually because it's a term that is overused
It is.
in the medical field. And there's a lot of standards of practice that prevent birthing folks from being able to have options to, there's like time constraints and like different interventions that are pushed, like maybe when they're not necessary. And all of that is contributing to this, okay, now you're failure to progress, but there wasn't proper opportunity or options given. And so for me, it's like more of those are all missed opportunities for connection and safety.
Yeah.
So failure to progress is really like there was a failure of safety. There was a failure of connection. And that's also one of those things where the terminology is putting the blame on the birthing person and not holding the systems and perpetrators of that system accountable.
Exactly. Yes. For my pregnancy with my second, I was diagnosed with an incompetent cervix.
Yes, another terrible term.
So fucking awful. And I was like, it's not incompetent. If anything, it's a little too competent. But when it came to time for the birth, I had weeks and weeks of prodromal labor, and every time I'm like, this isn't it. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And even going into the birth, I was like, well, something's going to go wrong. At least we're in a hospital because then they can take me to the OR if needed, which would have been fine. But like you said, just walking into something that big with that kind of mindset, it's almost like I was setting myself up for failure and a self-fulfilling prophecy, which thankfully it did not happen. Everything went well. But yeah, it's just, these terms and minding your language when it comes to working with people who have gone through a big T or a little t is really important. One thing I wanted to mention, going back to birth trauma and breastfeeding or chest feeding, is that the birthing person may also find it physically difficult to sit down to feed or to lay down to feed. Pumping might be really painful for them as well. So it's really important that they find a care provider who is willing to meet them where they are and really take their opinion and their lifestyle and whatever they're going through into account when it comes up with creating some sort of a feeding plan for them. The one thing I wanted to note too is that it's important to note too that for some people, breastfeeding, chest feeding, or pumping can help them heal from a traumatic birth. My birth was traumatic for me. My pregnancy was more so traumatic. And so for me, breastfeeding is the one thing that I really wanted to focus on and make sure it went right. And so I worked really hard to make things work, to make it painless for me, to make sure my son was gaining weight well. And for me, that was the redemption factor after a really difficult birth, after a really difficult pregnancy. And I have definitely worked with parents that are like, look, birth sucked. It was awful, but breastfeeding seems like the one thing that I have control of that I can do well. And I'm like, great, let me help you do it. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important too in those cases, or really in all cases, to find lactation support who understands that breastfeeding or chest feeding isn't all or nothing. There's lots of different options. They support exclusive pumping, combination feeding, use of donor milk, whatever it is that the family wants this plan to look like. I know that we talk a lot about birth trauma, and the words that we were using in birth trauma, but a lot of that comes up with lactation as well. I mean, there's a term, it's a coding term called lactation failure. And I hate that because it's not lactation failure. Oftentimes, just like you were saying, the failure to progress, it's not lactation that's failed, it's the system that failed the lactating person. Or it's the support that they had available at the time that failed them. And so, it's just one of those terrible terms. It is literally a coding term. And I hate it. It makes me so mad every time I have to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is like helping folks get some power back, right? So it can feel really empowering when you're given your options and you're able to choose whatever combination that you described that fits for you and your baby and your lifestyle, and that helps you feel like you're in control and doing something that feels good. Like that's really empowering, and it gives you power back that was taken from that traumatic experience.
Absolutely.
So I really like that. Yeah, you also were making me think about and maybe this is helpful to share, which I can't remember if we talked about last time or not, but just how like our first line of defense as humans when we are in a stress response is what's known as social engagement, aka connection.
Mm-hmm.
So the very first thing that we do is look to other humans for support. And thinking about everything we've talked about so far, like whether it's at a prenatal appointment or it's during the birth or it's at a lactation visit or a postpartum visit, like there's all these different opportunities where birthing people are essentially in front of a support person, and there's opportunity missed. That connection piece is missed. And then what happens to our body then is if that fails, if they're not able to connect with a safe human, then they enter into what we know as fight or flight or the freeze response, which the freeze response is one of like the very last lines of defense. It's literally like system shut down, like I give up.
Right.
And so kind of knowing what that process looks like, and for folks that are in our field, it's so valuable to me to know how much impact we can have when we make that connection, and just being really attuned to our clients and attuned to, not just verbally what they're telling us, but
physically. Oh, yeah.
Body language, like just all of it, like their facial expressions, like, and just being really tuned in. It's like so much information, and we have opportunity to meet them in this really vulnerable, painful space and offer an opportunity for healing.
Yeah. And, to go back to something that I know we've covered on literally dozens of podcasts, sometimes it's just holding space. It's letting them talk. It's listening, not trying to fix the problem, but just saying, that really sucks. I'm so sorry that you went through that. I'm so glad that your baby is okay, but I'm so sorry that you had to go through all that. And, that is something that I really feel like I excel at in my field. So if I do ask, oh, how did baby's birth go? And there's a pause, or there's the parents kind of shoot a look at each other. I'm like, we don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. And that's it.
Yeah. And that's offering, the key is like just offering the option of connection, right? So like, that's what you're doing there is like, how was your birth? Oh, I'm kind of sensing you're not ready to talk about it, but just know at any time, if you want to share anything, I'm here to listen.
Exactly.
Like, it just offers that option. And it may be the first time that someone has even asked them that question.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to my own experiences with my kids, and granted, it's been 10 and a half years and 7 years, so it's a little blurry now, but I don't think I was asked how the birth went by any of, not until I got to my own postpartum visit at 6 weeks. Did anybody ask? I don't think the pediatrician asked. The lactation consultants that I did see with the second one asked, but they were friends as well. So I think it was more of a friendly conversation. It definitely did not happen the first time around.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we may have said this before, but I think you did say this last time. Everyone wants to hold the baby, but who's holding the mother?
Yeah.
That's not our quote.
No, that is Jabina Coleman.
Yeah.
She's fantastic. She is a lactation consultant
and a therapist.
Yeah. She's got, if you search for her on Instagram or Facebook, she's got so much great info out there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think this kind of weaves into, I had put on here like common triggers. This kind of weaves into what we're talking about right now, in that if you work with the perinatal population, one, it's important to seek training on trauma-informed care. Like that just does not exist in any of your training.
No.
Like whatever your profession is, it doesn't exist in your training, including if you're a therapist.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
No, you have to seek it. Like you have to seek that on your own. Basically, you think you might know, but if you did not seek additional training on your own, you don't have it.
You don't know. Yeah, exactly.
you don't got it. Which shameless plug, I teach about this with Courtney Butts, who has been on our podcast before. She's also a doula and a therapist, but she's in Dallas. And we are really passionate about informing professionals so that we can have better outcomes. And so we have a side gig called Trauma Talk, and there's an online course. We do in-person trainings, which we haven't done since COVID, but they will eventually resume.
Really soon.
Yeah. But the point is that one piece of what we teach is about, not just having knowledge of trauma and what that response might look like, but also like how you can empower. And one of the ways that we can empower is by helping folks identify, especially if you have a previous experience and that you're going into birth, like knowing this might come up. What might trigger this for me and how can we limit that? And so I know I've talked about this when I've shared my birth stories, but like for me, a big trigger is cervical checks. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and those are just like horrendous.
Yeah.
And so, which unfortunately, that's a whole nother conversation, but even me with this knowledge and teaching about this and being really good at advocating for myself, the system still failed me. So even when I chose a home birth, I still had excessive cervical checks with a home birth. So back to your original point of like, this doesn't just happen in medical systems.
Right.
Even a home birth midwife failed me, right? So yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that this is something that we can help educate our clients on, is like, there may be things about this process that, bring up stuff. And so let's talk about what that may be and how we can help make a space that's super comfortable and feels safe for you. And then engaging what supports you might need to help make that a reality.
Right, right. That's a pretty good segue into something else that we wanted to speak about on this episode is, for those of you who have dealt with birth trauma or any kind of trauma in the past, is how to set yourself up to avoid it, how to kind of make sure that you're going in with the best possible environment, the best possible providers, all of that. One thing to note too, though, is that trauma can still happen even if you've done your due diligence.
Yeah.
Again, it's very much in the eye of the beholder, the eye of the birthing person. If they feel like it is traumatic despite doing all the things, then it was traumatic.
/ what I just described, like
Right.
the system is unfortunately set up to fail us.
Right.
Birth in this country is not a pretty system.
Right.
No matter where you do it.
Very true.
Yeah, I think I might add to that is like, again, this is like, I think about this in like risk reduction versus primary care. So risk reduction is what we're talking about right now. Risk reduction is, what can I do to reduce my risk of experiencing trauma in my birth space, which is putting the ownership on the victim, the survivor, right? Which sucks. It doesn't feel good. But primary prevention is, what's the root of the problem? How do we change the root of the problem so that we don't have to reduce our risk? So I think it's important to name that, because that's an unfortunate reality of birthing in the United States, is like, you have to risk reduction.
Yes.
Like you have to in order to have an empowered birth. And you have to equip yourself with some of this knowledge in order to avoid certain scenarios, right?
Outcomes, absolutely.
Yeah. But at the same time, we can't only do that. Like, we have to also be doing the work to uproot these systems and make them what they should be.
Yeah.
So
that's a very important point.
Yeah. But first step, find a provider that you trust, which is complex.
It is. It's very layered. And I think making sure, especially if you are a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, if you have a history of trauma, make sure you've got someone who's trauma informed. And, to that, what Alexis was saying earlier, they may say they're trauma informed, but are they really? And so I think it's important to do your homework to make sure that you're comfortable with them, you trust them, read reviews about them, ask in your Facebook moms group what people think about them and what their experiences was like. And honestly, go with your gut. If you meet them and something isn't sitting right with you, okay, listen to that. It's your spidey sense is tingling for a reason,
No, totally. Yeah. I know I've shared about this before, but when I got pregnant with Reese, it took forever
I remember.
to choose a provider
Yes.
for this very reason, because I uniquely, came into this third pregnancy having worked as a doula. So I had attended, many different births with different providers and witnessed a bunch of trauma, whether my clients perceived it as traumatic or not. I saw lots of harmful things happening, and I just didn't have a lot of faith in our city's providers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a sad, real reality. And I still kind of feel that way. Like COVID also illuminated a lot of
Absolutely.
things.
The inequities and the systems that are so broken.
Yeah. It's like really hard. It's like hard to sit in that and like, is there a perfect provider? So I think I might add to that is like all of the things you said. And you definitely need to feel safe with this person. You need to trust them, feel connected with them. Mm-hmm. But also like any work that you can do for yourself too, to help your body feel safe. So especially if you have a previous trauma, that's going to be helpful, like in conjunction of being surrounded by a safe team.
Yes. Very important.
Which is we have on here, like, what are the treatment options?
Yeah.
But let's keep talking about this before we jump there.
Yeah, I had also put consent in there because consent is king. I mean, that's even with what I do, I always ask parents, may I touch you? Can I show you how to do that? I don't ever dive in. Nobody has ever said no to me. I can't imagine anybody ever saying no to me. I mean, they're there for lactation help.
Yeah.
But I'm not just going to reach out and grab a boob. Like, I'm going to ask before I touch. I'm going to ask before I touch the baby. May I hold your baby and show you a soothing technique or whatever? Consent is the key. I think I don't remember who put it down. Somebody had said, I like to describe it as a conversation and not a signature. That was you. Okay, yeah.
That's what I like. That's the phrase I like to use.
Yeah,
like
talk
consent.
about that.
I mean, consent is not a form that you sign. It's not a signature. So just because a hospital got your signature does not mean that they have consent. It needs to be a conversation, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation. The conversation around consent is never over.
No.
Until the event is over.
Right.
Like it's a part of the entire process, and it should be continually asked for.
I saw this on Instagram today, on China Tolliver's Instagram, and it said, I heart fries. And fries is an acronym for consent. Consent should be freely given. It should be reversible. It should be informed. It should be enthusiastic, and it should be specific. So lots of credit to her for that, because I feel like it puts it in a very easy way to digest. It's easy to remember. So we'll definitely put a link to that in our show notes too, in case anybody wants to check out the graphic.
Yeah. I saw another graphic today where it showed like, I'm going to say it wrong. I'll have to look it up and include it in the show notes. But like one column was people in charge at your birth, and it had like doctor, nurse, midwife, other medical professional. I don't remember. And then it was like, who's really in charge at your birth? And it was the birthing person, you.
Right.
And so I think that's another failure of the system, is that we're told that we aren't in charge.
Yeah.
That we don't have agency in our care, that we don't have a voice. Those are all the messages that we receive, right?
It's like we're told birth happens to us rather than including us.
Yeah. It's our body.
Right.
So I think a piece of that is like also just like educating, around like consent is something that we all deserve all the time.
And we can start it from a young age with our kids, but we have...
Absolutely.
We have definitely discussed this before on a podcast. Yes. I'll try to find that and link that one in our show notes too, if you want to know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I think that kind of leads into the other bullet here about advocating for yourself, which can be hard to do when you're birthing. You're busy. Yeah. Like you're doing a big thing.
You got other things on your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is why other support people exist. So whether that's your partner, or a doula, or a friend, again, you want safe people in your space that that you trust and that are going to help you feel empowered and help advocate for what you need or want in that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And again, the way that we talked about finding a provider you trust, if you want to to hire a doula or what have you, again, ask in your local moms groups. Interview several before you make your decision. I think something that we tend to forget as we go into birthing is that we are the consumer after all. And so if you don't like a care provider, if you don't like a nurse that's on staff that day, you can ask for another one, which is something I didn't realize with my first, and I wish I had. If you don't like your OB or if you don't like your midwife, okay, go talk to somebody else. If you don't like the person that you selected as your doula, if things have changed, if your perspective has shifted and they're not in line with the new perspective, okay, ask around, interview a couple and find somebody else.
Yeah, you can fire your provider. Didn't we both? I know I changed providers in 2 of my pregnancies.
I changed providers with one, and it was at 26 weeks or something like that. It was almost my 3rd trimester.
Yeah, I was like 30-something weeks both times.
Yeah, I remember thinking, oh, they're going to feel so bad. I feel so bad. They don't fucking care.
No.
You know what I mean?
Well, and you're never going to see them again.
Exactly, exactly. And I do not regret that decision one bit. Yeah.
No. Well, let's spend the last piece of our time answering some of the questions we didn't get to. So one is, are you ever fully healed from it, and how do you move through it?
That's a good question. I feel like trauma might be a little bit like grief, where it'll kind of pop its head up at a moment where you're not expecting it. For me personally, I do think time has dulled it a bit. I don't want to say I'm fully healed from it. I still, we're not having we're not having any more babies, but, if we were, then the precipitous birth I had is definitely something that I would bring to, and the precipitous birth and the pregnancy is something, or some things that I would bring to this other potential future birth. And, that's some heavy shit to have to deal with. So I don't know that you are ever healed from it. As far as how to move through it, with support, with connection, talking through it with your therapist, if that's the key, debriefing with your doula, with your partner, support person, whoever was there present for the birth can be really helpful too. Talking, just vocalizing how you felt during it, especially if you didn't feel like you had power or you felt like things were being done to you without your consent. Talk about it. Raise a stink. You don't even have to raise a stink, but just talk about it with somebody. And that can help tremendously with processing what happened to you.
Yeah, I think I would add that, being human doesn't ever stop.
Right.
So, I can use my personal experience. I've been in therapy for a long ass time. I've used lots of different modalities, and my most recent modality was EMDR. Mm-hmm. And I did a lot of work before my 3rd and final pregnancy to help my body know that it was safe and that it wasn't broken. And then my birth happened. Being human happened. COVID happened, right. All these things outside of my control. So no, it doesn't really ever end in a sense of yes, I got to a point in my healing where these other traumas were something that happened in the past. They didn't feel like they were happening to me in the present. Mm-hmm. But then a new event happened that is very similar to the other events. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm kind of back in this healing journey all over again, right? And I think that's the same way that some folks describe the grief journey.
Yes.
When you brought that up of it comes in waves, there's times when you're doing really well and then something reminds you of it and it's whoa,
take a big step back.
Here we are again.
Or it seems like it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think humanizing anything in itself can be healing of we're fucking human. Life is going to happen.
Right.
Hard things are going to happen and that's okay. And so it's no, the goal should not be to stop being human.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
Yeah. That's my contribution to that question.
Well, let's talk. I don't think we covered this one on the last episode.
I deleted the ones we did.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're so smart. The question is, I'm curious whether your guest can recommend any specific complementary treatments for postpartum PTSD. This person is in regular psychotherapy with EMDR, and it's definitely helpful, but they're curious about complementary treatments or other helpful knowledge about postpartum PTSD. This person says, I had literally never heard of it until I was experiencing it myself and figured it out on my own.
Yeah, there's a couple books that would answer this question. The Body Keeps the Score is a really good book. Bessel van der Kolk is the author, and he talks about a lot of the different evidence-based trauma treatments that exist. But there really are a ton of options. I would say, well, I'll kind of list some of them off if that feels good. So there's yoga has been found to be really effective with healing trauma, expressive arts, sand tray therapy.
Breath work?
Breath work. Gosh, I'm forgetting some. EMDR, somatic experiencing. Brain spotting is another one. I'm forgetting some. But we can include a better list on our show notes since I'm answering this on the fly. But essentially the answer is there are a ton of options. Yes, there are so many different options. And it doesn't just, I think for a lot of people when they hear therapy, like they think of traditional talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about all of the other modalities that I just listed is that like they aren't traditional talk therapy and they weave in techniques that don't require words, which is really hard for survivors.
Right.
And so it allows you to like incorporate the body, incorporate movement, incorporate other modes of expression to help you kind of move through that experience.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I think I got those down.
Cool.
Okay, so the last question that we didn't get to on our last episode is, it's my understanding that therapists are pretty overwhelmed right now with the pandemic. Many are not taking new clients, or wait times to get in to see a new therapist can be up to 8 weeks long. My best friend reached out the other day for support, admitting she is experiencing PPD from birth trauma and needs help. She has an 11-week-old, or at the time she had an 11-week-old, and she cannot find a therapist for the reasons I mentioned above. So my question is, when therapy is unavailable or delayed due to wait times to get in, what do you recommend struggling mothers do? Where can they find support outside of a one-on-one therapist?
Ugh, this is like so true.
This is the reality right now.
Yeah. And when I returned from maternity leave, like some of my colleagues were like, thank goodness we can send people to you.
Yeah.
And I filled up. I'm still not full. I still have space, but I got like a pretty full caseload pretty immediately because so many folks are inundated right now.
Yeah.
Just COVID, people were home and like struggling, and it was an opportunity to seek help when there hasn't been opportunity before.
Right.
Because I think that's what it did, is it like for a lot of people, it was the first time where they even had time and space to do that.
Yes.
Right.
Or they had to be still and realize that they needed help or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one is like support group can be really huge in these scenarios. So you would want to I would recommend finding a support group specifically for trauma survivors.
Can I name a resource?
Uh-huh.
Postpartum Support International has a ton of fantastic groups geared towards all kinds of parents, parenting styles, birth experiences. They all meet free. They're all virtual, and they're in a small group setting. Obviously not one-on-one therapy, but there's so much power in knowing that you're not alone in how you're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then also, I think that you can seek support from other professionals that aren't necessarily therapists. So like I know I saw a yoga therapist for a while. So like there's other professionals that aren't necessarily a counselor or a social worker that have the ability to support survivors specifically. So I like loved my yoga therapist and found wonderful healing through that support as well. I'd imagine that they too may be inundated right now, and that doesn't really solve the problem. But again, I think if we go back to when we were defining trauma, like in the simplest terms, something is traumatic because it wasn't safe and there wasn't connection. And so like those are the things we need to achieve, right? Mm-hmm. So who are your safe people? Who can you connect to that, who can you connect with that is going to be non-judgmental, that isn't going to say all that matters is a healthy baby.
Right.
Like that person that you trust and feel comfortable with, and you can like share some of your deep, dark, scary thoughts with, and they're not going to shame you. Mm-hmm. They're going to hold that space for you. And say, I'm so glad that you shared this with me. You're not alone, right?
Right.
Which isn't perfect either, but
it's a start.
Yeah. So just like seeking connection, whether that's through support group or a friend or a family member, or being creative with, other professionals. I can share that I recently, she's a therapist, so I guess this doesn't count either, but she was on our podcast too, Genevieve, Passageway Arts. She's also what's the word for what she does? A celebrant? No.
Celebrant. Yep.
Is that right? Okay, yeah. She's a celebrant, so she's like really big into ritual and like does funerals and weddings and all this stuff.
For any big life transition.
So she basically created this like intensive like studio session where we did like ritual around a transition. And so I went into it with like, I want to give space to like all the grief I've been feeling about what it was like to have to give birth during a pandemic. And we had a funeral. Like she basically had like, I laid down and she like did all these different rituals to like help me, process what I needed to process. And then we literally like had a funeral for this part of me. So we like drew an outline of my body and I like did some expressive art stuff with that. And like we literally had like, she read, what do you call it?
Eulogy?
A eulogy. She read a eulogy. Like I read a prayer. Like we did like this whole thing to have a funeral. And while that was not therapy, it was like she's not marketing it as therapy either. It's literally like a ceremony. Getting creative like that, like finding something like that, because that was incredibly helpful and like it's something that I could also take with me. So she like sent me with like a gift bag of things to kind of continue the work and continue the grief work. And so finding something like that too could be helpful when it's hard to find a provider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. That's all we got. No, we could say more, but we're about out of time.
Yeah. Well, this was fun.
Yeah. It was nice to get back in person and do this in person, not via Zoom.
Yeah.
And in this cool new studio. So that was awesome. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you like what you hear, follow us on social media or support our Patreon. Bye.
Bye. If the Top Knot Squad's content makes you laugh, nod in agreement, or makes you feel less alone, we'd love your support in the cost of producing this podcast. Visit patreon.com/TopKnotSquad to learn more about our budget-friendly sponsorship tiers and how you can help ensure that TKS has a future. Every little bit helps.
If you like what you hear, then be sure to click the subscribe button in your podcast app. While you're there, leave us a review. You can find us on social media. Just search for Top Knot Squad. We welcome your feedback and love making new friends.